everybody. My name is Ekaterina Zhuravskaya. I am one of the editors of this book, which is entitled Nation Building: Big Lessons from Successes and Failures. And the other editor is Dominic Rohner. He will speak later. And I would like to start with thanking CEPR for making all this happening, because actually we've got a lot of support from CEPR in putting it all together. And we are absolutely convinced that this book is a good endeavor, because it will be an important resource for scholars and for policymakers. So the next thing I want to highlight is how important are the contributions of many authors to this book. It actually is a product of 57 authors. You see the cloud of last names of the brilliant contributors to the 26 chapters of this book. And of course, in the hour which we have, we won't be able to cover all the complexity of it, but we would like to just introduce a little bit of what this book is about. So what it is about and why now? Well, for millennia already, philosophers and politicians have recognized that social cohesion is a very crucial factor in stability, security, and development. And by social cohesion, we mean the degree to which the members of a society have a common identity and a shared sense of responsibility for well-being of all members of the society, not just themselves. Why now then? Well, it's simply because we've seen in the last decade a huge rise in the very important body of work in political economics on nation building. And we thought that this is a good moment to take a stock and try to understand what are the big lessons from this literature. So the idea of this book is to rely on these recent advances in order to try to understand the answer of the two overriding central questions of the book. First, which policies are adequate to build social cohesion in which circumstances in different countries, and what are the perils of social cohesion and pitfalls of building it? And of course, nation building is a very complex, multifaceted phenomenon. There are many internal and external factors which matter for nation building, and the diversity and the number of individual chapters actually has showing it very well, because they describe them in great detail. So now I would like to take a few moments just to step back and talk a little bit about the introductory chapter, which we wrote jointly with Dominic Rohner, the other editor of the book. And there we take several steps back and essentially strip the problem to a bare minimum by focusing only on two aspects of internal factors, two aspects of ethno-linguistic diversity of the countries: polarization and segregation. Polarization, which is maximized when there are two equal-sized groups in the society, reflects the potential salient antagonisms of the societies. When you have large polarization, that eases the emergence of what we call social identity, the identity which comes from social comparisons where people divide the society into us and them intrinsically. In segregation, of course, this is the extent to which different groups live in the same or different areas in the society. And with large segregation, what happens is that the threat of secession becomes more credible, and also it reduces contact between different groups, which potentially may diminish intergroup trust and cooperation. So if we simply look at all the countries for which the data exists on the very simple plane with two axes, polarization and segregation, we can single out three very different areas in terms of the feasible and desirable nation building strategies for these countries. And let me just in a few words describe what they are. Let's start with seemingly the most obvious strategy of the countries which you can see in the low segregation polarization corner. These are homogeneous countries. And these countries can build national identity around simply common culture, which is a luxury that diverse countries do not have. Yet, even in this corner, we see the danger of potentially rising conflict, in particular, which it has to do with the aggressive nationalism. It can be illustrated by the fact that essentially all countries with the large-scale fascist movements before the Second World War were in this corner. Think Germany, Italy, Japan, or Austria. Why is that the case? Well, because the totalitarian leaders actually can use this unity of the nation to motivate its population to go into aggressive war, which highlights the importance of democracy, which essentially eliminates the risk of such conflict. So let's look now at the other areas. In particular, if we look at the pink segment, which is the countries with high segregation, they actually have very different means and possibilities for nation building. In particular, they are comprised of homogeneous regions which are populated by different groups. That essentially leads immediately to the rise of the strong regionalist identities, which may or may not come into conflict with a national identity. Particularly when it does, that leads to conflict, that leads to separatism and up to a breakup, essentially, of nations. In particular, many countries which used to be in the map of the world, like Yugoslavia and USSR, are not there anymore. They were in this corner. And of course, we know how devastating that breakup was. There's, of course, one counterexample to a non-peaceful breakup of a nation, Czechoslovakia, but it is definitely an exception. So what countries can do in this corner to build nations? And we use Switzerland actually as a showcase to recognize that the countries are not doomed. You can build a nation, but this nation needs to be built, but not only recognizing, but actually embracing the differences between different parts of the country. Switzerland too had secessionist wars during the 19th century, and it ended with the consensus of a new constitution based on power sharing and federalism, recognizing the differences and giving power to different groups. And in fact, if we think about whether Switzerland is an exception, of course, every country is an exception, yet this actually turns out to be the typical strategy for democracies in this corner. Think of UK, Spain, post-apartheid, South Africa, what have you. Of course, these countries have many problems. Many of them are driven directly by the large segregation, yet the power sharing helps to prevent worse outcomes here. And that can be illustrated by what's happening with autocracies in this corner, where very often ethnic tensions explode into full-blown wars. Of course, the autocrats, and we have several chapters in the book about that, try to address these challenges. And one of the ways in which that's happening is through forced assimilation. But this is, of course, very costly to the minority and very often backfires. So just to sum up what we are doing, let me finish with the summary of the third group of countries which have low segregation and high polarization, which is the yellow area in the graph. And here, there are the countries with inherent ethnic divisions, but which don't have any geographical dimension. So the groups actually live together in close proximity. So what is the right way to go as far as nation building in this part of the graph? We argue that that should be what we call a melting pot strategy. What does it mean? Well, that means that one needs to try to make the ethnic differences the least salient possible. So the idea of building a nation by fostering identity which is orthogonal to the ethnic differences. And both democracies and autocracies on this corner indeed use public education, propaganda, focusing on shared positive history, or in fact common external threats and enemies in order to focus on something which is non-ethnic. Importantly, what comes out of the chapters of the book is that opening to immigration actually can help this strategy by reducing polarization. So overall, it is clear that none of these strategies are easy. Each can fail and backfire. And the many chapters by individual contributors of this book describe concrete examples of the perils, the costs, and the benefits of each of them, and we find it super exciting. Let me now pass the word to Dominic, who will just talk briefly about the structure of the book. Thank you.
Thanks a lot again, also to CEPR. Thanks a lot for attending today. So yeah, I'll just talk about the structure of the book a little bit. I'll be brief, deliberately, and also then just on the the main policy lessons. So, well, first, we tried to kind of divide the literature in some key themes. First one is on contact hypothesis versus social identity. Second, education, then propaganda, then external interventions, wars, and then institutions. And so, well, the first part, and so here you also have always the chapter number of all chapters. And I've seen that in the call, we have several of the authors of chapters also in the call. So thanks again for all the fabulous work. Well, the chapter one is the intro chapter that Katja just explained before. But so now then the following chapters are from chapter 2 to 7, and they are about the contact hypothesis. The idea being that, well, there are two ways psychologists have looked at the potential for cooperation and conflict. One is contact hypothesis, saying that basically, well, if you meet somebody very different from a very different background, and this meeting is kind of fair and open and democratic and non-oppressive, then your contact may kind of create open-mindedness, and it's actually good news in terms of making you more open and tolerant and diffuses tensions. And then there's social identity theory, which is kind of very different, where a group defines itself as a group as opposed to others. And so in this kind of field of tension between these two angles are situated the first few chapters of the book. So the first 3 chapters are really about diversity and how diversity matters for Indonesia, for the Russian Empire, and for India, South Asia. Then there's a chapter 5, where we kind of talk about the micro foundations in terms of game theoretically, how to think about contact theory. And then chapter 6 and 7, they are about some kind of natural experiments where people meet kind of more randomly more often. So people kind of, from Andalusia being then in Catalonia as Spanish soldiers, or the other way around. So that's for Spain, or then same for Nigeria, again, where due to randomization, some people, they're suddenly exposed to very different contexts. And what you find is that, well, this can kind of have very good impact. Especially the chapter 7 finds that actually you can, by having contact in the right circumstances, you can increase national identity without, however, giving up regional identity. We can have several identities. I can feel like, attached to Geneva and Lausanne, but at the same time attached to Switzerland, and at the same time attached to Europe and the world. So that's kind of the first, big section of the book. Then education. Education is a key theme here. And the chapters, they show how education was a pillar of creating French identity, then also for America, chapters on Andalusia, a chapter on the impact of curriculum in China. So Noam will talk about that. Then on Germany, and chapter 13, Vicky will talk about, and 14 on Indonesia. So again, so you'll have like 2 of the talks later on today exactly on this very key theme for nation building. Then next, propaganda and charisma. So to simplify, if democracies try to create national identity through education and by building up civic identity, well, dictatorships more often would bet on propaganda and charisma, and with kind of potentially high risks, of course. And so chapters that would look at Rwanda, the US, Croatia, Turkey, France, and also on the role of soccer. So as you see, it's like a mixed bag. Some of these countries are democratic and others are not. So really kind of looking at the role of propaganda in a variety of contexts. Then next big section of the book, external interventions. For US military aid, for US intervention in Vietnam, and also now the impact of the first, well, the annexation of Crimea some years ago. And so what you see in these chapters in general is something that this outside military intervention kind of backfires in terms of identity building. That's, you know, if anything, the intervening outside force becomes, if anything, less popular. So that's another angle of the book. Further angle on institutions. We talk about power sharing. Joachim will talk right away afterwards as well on the New Deal of Roosevelt, and then the last chapter on kind of, well, you know, what pushes leaders to invest in nation building. So that's kind of the big structure of the book. So now let's also then have a few conclusions. What we see, as Katja was already saying, is democracy is really the backbone of sustainable and peaceful nation building. Lack of democracy has different impacts in the different zones. So in the zone of national cohesion, you know, in a very homogeneous country, lack of democracy may lead to fascism. While in a zone of very high segregation, lack of democracy may lead to secessionism. So the impact of lack of democracy is different in different zones, but what it has in common is that it's always bad. So democracy is really the key pillar of the whole thing. And without it, the building will crumble. The second big conclusion that we find is that intergroup contact can be a force of good and promote the melting pot society, reduce conflict, if it's well managed with security guarantees and not exploitative, etc. Third, fostering a positive common identity through education can be very important in a situation of high polarization and low segregation. You want to build kind of, you know, a melting pot society where everybody feels to belong to this society. So, for example, when I spent a year in Canada, at least in my, you know, British Columbia, seemed to be really good at that, at bringing everybody on board. Then fourth conclusion, power sharing matters. So there is some, well, we talk about it in a chapter, and also some recent work of Hannes Müller and Christopher Rau finds that really power sharing is a key force that can diffuse tensions. And last but not least, what we see is that, you know, unilateral military intervention and military aid to non-democratic regimes can often backfire, actually, in terms of the attitudes of the local population. But UN peacekeeping security guarantees. So there is work, for example, by Lisa Hultmann, a political scientist and co-authors, finding that UN peacekeeping, you know, that's backed up by many countries, is usually a force of good and can prevent a lot of atrocities. So I should stop here in the interest of time. So far, we're still more or less on schedule, and I hand over to Noam now.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be part of the book launch. Thanks to the editors for inviting me and my co-authors to contribute to this really amazing and comprehensive book that's comprehensive. And I think also raises questions. So I hope to leave you with some answers and some questions. But the topic of my chapter with my co-authors was curriculum and ideology. And in some ways, I think it is very fundamental. I mean, going back, I learned recently, going back even further than we appreciated it, maybe when we wrote the chapter in the paper that it was based on, But going to Plato's Republic, Plato himself clearly viewed education as fundamental to nation building, and the choice of educational content is fundamental. So I don't know how many of you remember your Republic from college or whenever you read it, but you can go back and reread it. And he writes about the guardians, the leaders of his idealized city. Then we have found the desired natures of the guardians. He initially discusses the natures of these elites. And now that we have found them, how are they to be reared and educated? Is not this an inquiry which may be expected to throw light on the greater inquiry, which is our final end? How do justice and injustice grow up in states? So as you build the state, you think about educating your society. And now, what does he say about education? Is it some sort of ideal? Well, I don't know. In some ways, it sounds closer to brainwashing. So Plato's Republic, Socrates says, and shall we just carelessly allow children to hear any casual tales which may be devised by casual persons, and to receive into their minds ideas, for the most part, very opposite of those which we should wish them to have when they are grown up? And Adiamantus says, we cannot. So Socrates notes, then the first thing will be to establish a censorship of the writers of fiction, and let the censors receive any tale of fiction which is good and reject the bad. So there's a sense that school curricula are going to be chosen to shape ideology and national identity, and perhaps can be used to brainwash in some way, maybe desirable and maybe not. And social scientists, I think, have studied both possibilities in different episodes throughout history. So social scientists have seen a link between the content of education and nation building and ideological outcomes, from the formation of the French national identity in the 19th century, the Russian national identity that was attempted to be constructed through the correct, in quotes, teaching of history to encompass the Ukraine, an ultra-nationalist Nazi ideology in Germany under the Third Reich, the development of a Catalan identity, and the cultivation of citizens who are capable of participating in a democratic system, for example, in the US. So links for the good and bad between educational content and the types of citizens and types of state that is produced. The challenge of an empirical economist in trying to link educational content to nation building and ideological outcomes is the usual causal inference challenge. How do we know if educational content is really what is causing some of the ideological changes that we've observed in history? Many scholars have done some clever things. They've done some deep historical work as well. One of the challenges that we often face is that new curricula get introduced across time to different cohorts. And so when we study the impact of curricula, we see some cohorts who are more exposed than others, but of course, cohorts differ in ways other than their exposure to a new curriculum. We try to address this challenge of identifying a causal effect of curriculum, in some ways purged of cohort differences, in a paper that my co-authors and I wrote and published in 2017, which we describe in chapter 11 of the book. So the context that we study is a particular curricular reform, China's 8th textbook reform, which changed the politics curriculum for senior high school students, grades 10 through 12. This politics curriculum was updated almost in every province, from the same old version to the same new version, and it was high stakes. So all students were examined on this content as part of their college entrance process. It was high stakes also from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party. The author of the textbook, Tian Xinming, wrote, writing the politics textbook is an act at the state level rather than an academic activity of the individual author. With a large readership, it will influence an entire generation of young people. Of course, that's what we aim to test. He was very optimistic. Now, what's crucial for causal inference was the staggered introduction, as is the case with many Chinese policies. A new policy was introduced in different regions in different years, in this case at the province level. And so what that allows us to do is to study a province where there's an early, say, introduction of the new curriculum, compare across cohorts who see different curricula very sharply, one cohort to the next, and how can we rule out a pure cohort difference driving any change or any difference in outcomes across cohorts? Well, we can compare the cross-cohort difference in a province that experienced a change in textbooks to the same cross-cohort difference in another province that hasn't yet seen the textbook reform. And so we have a difference in difference where we can compare these provinces that are treated across cohorts to provinces that haven't yet been treated. And that gives us the difference in difference that allows us to pull out cohort effects and pull out province effects as well, and identify arguably the effect of the curriculum per se. Now, how do we study this textbook reform? Well, the first thing to do is to identify what are the ideological changes desired. And by reading government documents, we identified the following 5 attitude changes that the government aimed for: informing students and shaping students' views of governance, essentially to teach students that Chinese officials adhered to the rule of law and were legitimate because of that. Views on Chinese political institutions. So there's the introduction of teaching about democratic institutions in China, which were not unconstrained democracy, to be clear, but involved elections within constraints. More skeptical teaching regarding markets and economic institutions, a new teaching on Chinese identity becoming more all-encompassing, and attitudes that were more pro-environment. We examine the content of the old and new textbooks and can quantify changes in the use of words relating to these 5 attitude changes that we identified from government documents. And what we find is that the content areas that we believe the government was aimed at changing, or the attitude areas, are also associated with larger changes in the frequency of related words. So compared to typical words, which are the dashed line running through the axes here, this dashed line exhibits the average word essentially having no change in frequency, but words that we associated with the ideological changes desired by the government experience big positive changes in frequency from the old textbooks to the new. As an example, the word election changed in its raw count from 2 in the old textbooks to 120 in the new. How can we test whether the curriculum change had an effect? We conducted a survey with Peking University undergraduates. These undergraduates come from across China, which gives us the cross-province variation, and they have different cohorts: freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. We email all of the undergraduates and get around a 20% response rate and no differential response by textbook studied. And for each of the textbook reform goals, we designed a set of survey questions aimed at identifying any change in the relevant attitudes. We construct indices for each of these content or ideology areas, and then we can track or plot cohort by cohort attitudes in these indices. And what you see for each of these graphs are attitudes for a set of cohorts: 2 or more cohorts before the curriculum change, 1 cohort before the curriculum change, then 1 cohort after, and 2 or more cohorts after. Essentially, you can think of this like an event study graph where we track attitude changes across cohorts prior to any curriculum change, where we typically see very little difference in attitudes across cohorts, and then just after the curriculum change, where for governance, for political institutions, and for economic institutions, we see ideological changes in the direction desired by the Chinese state. We don't see that for all dimensions of attitude change, however. Now, what can we generalize from this Chinese context? Well, curricula remain contested. They remain contested in authoritarian environments. This is an image from a protest against a proposed curriculum change in Hong Kong in 2012, where China tried to introduce national education into Hong Kong, and it was rebuffed in that by collective action. In America, we see political polarization reflected in debates over curricula. This is a New Yorker article from just late last year regarding school board conflicts regarding educational content in American schools. And so school curricula remain contested and therefore remain an open area, I think, for us to think about nation building, ideological change in modern political economy. what are some policy implications and how do we think about the contemporary world in history? Well, I think, Melvin Kranzberg wrote about the history of technology, but I think education and educational content is similar. It's not good or bad, but it's also not neutral. Education shapes ideologies. The question is to what purpose? And it can shape ideologies in a way that's harmful or beneficial in democracies. And when we think about polarized democracies like the US, I think there's scope for educational content to perhaps, in quotes, slightly brainwash students, but ideally not so negative a term as brainwashing, but to try to find common ground and build common ground, to build a national identity that reinforces democracy. Under autocracies, it's very clear that nation building content, the brainwashing, can be extremely harmful and can lead to the rise of ultra-nationalism. And in places like China and Russia, we hope for some sort of civil society backlash or response. And that takes us to Vicky Fuca's wonderful work, which I will now listen to a discussion on.
Thanks very much to Katya and to Dominic for including me in this project. I really enjoyed writing the chapter and reading the other chapters. And in fact, I'm teaching an undergrad seminar on nationalism, and I've assigned already several of these chapters. They're a great way to introduce the topics to students who may not know the methodologies of the actual paper. So there's a lot of utility to this project. So my chapter, like Noam's and many others in this ebook, is on education and its role on nation building. And Noam previewed this much better than I will. Education, the language used in education, the content of the curriculum is one of the most powerful tools for nation building that states have at their disposal. It has been extensively used both today and historically. All of the European nation states that consolidated in the 19th and 20th centuries used nationalist content in education to achieve this goal. In many cases, very successfully. The most famous example is the conversion of peasants into Frenchmen in 19th century France, and there's a chapter in the book on this. There's even evidence that even compulsory education introduced in the US had the goal of nation building and incorporating immigrants coming from Europe and not sharing the civic values of Americans. So one question we can ask is, even though education is extensively used as a nation building tool, the goal of homogenization through education, and specifically assimilation of minorities, may not always succeed. And there are both empirical and theoretical reasons to think that attempts like that might face resistance. So empirically, if we look at even the most successful educational reforms, like the ones introduced in France in the 19th century, Weber describes this, they faced fierce resistance. So the peasants resisted the introduction of French for many decades. So it took a very long time until this actually became successful. And then theoretically, we may think that minorities may resent the imposition of a majority identity through education. This is something that also accords with theoretical models that we have, frameworks of cultural transmission in which parents value their culture. They can invest in their children's identity to counteract the influence of other identities that the children are exposed to, also through education. So it's an empirical question whether this resistance to assimilation of minorities through education will manifest or not. And this is the focus of my chapter. I study this in the case of foreign language bans in the United States. These were language restrictions that were introduced by various US states between 1917 and 1923. They were motivated by World War I. So the US enters the war in 1917, and that increases patriotic sentiment in the country, and it also increases xenophobic sentiment targeted specifically at immigrants, and even more specifically at German immigrants, because Germany was the enemy in this war. So the goal of the restrictions is to instill patriotism in immigrant children, to reduce the importance of what was known as hyphenated identities, German Americans instead of just Americans. Most of these laws were English only, so introducing English as the main language of instruction in primary education, but some of them, like the ones I'm studying here, explicitly ban the German language, and they do this not only in public schools, but also in private and parochial schools. And this was only the second time that something like that had happened in US history. And the fact that this affected the private sphere of educational provision was what later led to the repeal of these laws as unconstitutional. So this is interesting because until that time, there was no negative sentiment against Germans in the US. They were a large immigrant group. In 1900, the first and second generation together were 10% of the US population. But compared to other immigrants coming from the South and Eastern Europe, they were more educated, more highly skilled, and they were even culturally and even in terms of appearance closer to Anglo-Saxons. And this is something that, as the quote here indicates, made them easily assimilable to some extent. But because of their emphasis on education, they did operate a dense network of schools, many of them operated by the churches that taught the German language. So they did conserve their language and culture through education. So this case is interesting because these restrictions, at least in terms of their timing, were not motivated by the lack of integration of the group that they were targeting. Their goal was explicit assimilation of this minority and of immigrants in general, so nation building. And because if we look at the fact that Germans were culturally quite similar to Anglo-Saxons, we might expect that this is one case where attempt at homogenization will actually succeed because of this low cultural distance. I'm looking at this empirically by looking at the states that banned German, Indiana and Ohio, and comparing them to their neighboring states in the difference in differences framework, comparing both across states and across cohorts. So those that by compulsory schooling law should have been at school at the time these laws were enacted, and older cohorts that would have left school at that time. And for much of the paper, I'm looking at children of German parents who lived in 1920, at the time these laws were in effect, in counties at the border of Indiana and Ohio to their neighboring states. And I link them to later census years in 1930 and 1940, so as to observe their outcomes as adults and their identity, various measures of identity in adulthood. So this is the area that this paper focuses on for much of the analysis, which is this border of Indiana and Ohio in red, neighboring states in blue. And the measures of identity that I examine are naming choices. So the names that these German American children chose for their own offspring, and the extent to which these names were revealing of ethnic German origin. Intermarriage decisions, whether they married a spouse of German origin. And the decision to volunteer in the US Army during World War II, which is an interesting decision for Germans because to some extent it's a binary identity decision, choosing between Germany, the country of their parents, and the United States, the country in which they were born and grew up. And so the results reveal that there is an intensification of German identity among exposed cohorts. So this is showing you the name index of the firstborn son. Firstborn sons tended to get more ethnically distinctive, more German names. And the x-axis shows cohort of birth. So the first cohort we would expect to have been affected is the cohort that was age 16 or younger when these laws were passed in 1919. And we see that the German content of the names increases for younger cohorts and increases in exposure to these laws. There are similar results for endogamy, which I'm not showing here, and similar results for volunteering rates, here just split in cohorts exposed at compulsory age and older. So volunteering rates for older cohorts are lower, an increase for younger cohorts, but this increase only comes from states that did not have these language bans in place. And the difference between states with and without the law is of the order of 2.5 percentage points, which is large given that volunteering rates were about 11%. So what is the mechanism that drives this? This is at least consistent with frameworks of intergenerational transmission of culture in which we could think of schooling and parental investment as substitutes. So if among the German population, some types can be thought of as oppositional, namely types that resist the majority culture, then an increase in the majority identity content of education would lead these types to invest more in their culture at home. And through some amplification mechanism, this could produce backlash. There are some predictions that derive from this that are consistent with what we see in the data. We have also some direct evidence for the substitution. This comes from statistical yearbooks of the Lutheran Church, which was more than the Catholic Church emphasizing German language and German culture. And this is the percentage change in activities of the church in the period before and after the law. And the one significant change that we see is more pupils enrolled in Sunday schools in Indiana and Ohio. And Sunday schools were the schools that were not subject to this law. So if there was a way for parents to basically have their children exposed to the German language and culture, it would be through Sunday schools. There's no evidence that the churches otherwise modify, their emphasis on culture, for example, by giving more sermons in German. So how generalizable is this? Clearly, this shows that backlash is a possibility in response to assimilation attempts, but not that it will always happen. And indeed, when we look across various empirical cases, many of them are in this ebook, we see that language policies and other modifications of the curriculum have all sorts of effects. Sometimes they're very successful, as was the case of 19th century France, or the case of linguistic normalization in Catalonia. Sometimes, as with broader English-only laws in the US, they have null effects on integration of immigrants. In other instances that support the findings in this chapter, they generate backlash, as was the case with secularization reforms in Turkey and religious backlash, or Germanization in Prussia and backlash of identity among minorities like the Poles. What makes backlash more likely? I would say that it depends on what the mechanism is that generates it. And if we look at the theoretical literature, we can see that various theoretical mechanisms can explain it, both at the individual level, from a social identity framework, and at the community level, such as, for example, the intergenerational transmission framework that I think explains the findings in this chapter. And so I would say that by synthesizing this theoretical literature and the empirical studies that I mentioned, my takeaways would be 3 important factors. There are more, but I would emphasize these 3. The first one is how attainable assimilation targets are relative to the assimilation costs of minorities. And to these assimilation costs, we should also factor in identity costs. So when minorities are called to abandon identities they're very attached to, or values they hold very dearly, such as religious values, I think backlash is more likely. Backlash instead is less likely when the returns to both education and to adoption of the majority identity are high. And this can explain why we see successful homogenization in 19th century France, because this was a period of not only educational reforms, but also very high returns to adopting standard Parisian French, through which one could achieve very high rates of socioeconomic mobility. And then finally, the reverse side of the returns to assimilation are the costs of non-assimilation, or the penalties for non-compliance. So cases of failed reforms like English-only laws in the US were cases in which authors have highlighted very lax enforcement. So I would say that combined, setting attainable goals and providing incentives, so high returns to majority identity, together with actual enforcement, can make nation building through education more successful. And I think this is an interesting conclusion, because it suggests that in some instances, rather than forced assimilation or forced monolingualism, for example, more relaxed interventions, such as bilingualism, might actually have better effects at homogenizing and increasing social cohesion. So I would encourage you to read the rest of the ebook for more, and thank you very much.
What's the difference between chimpanzees and humans? Well, if you believe the award-winning book author Yuval Harari in *Sapiens*, it's the mythical glue that allows humans to cooperate in huge groups of genetically unrelated individuals. And one of those forms of mythical glue is what we call nationhood. The entirely invented category that designates people who are genetically as different as they pretty much are from any other human being as members of one group, with the expectation that they cooperate to a greater extent, undertake altruistic actions, engage in costly activities that benefit this particular group. And how to construct this, of course, is one of the key questions in this book. Now, there's many ways in which different factors contribute to national identity. We've talked about schoolroom indoctrination, shared language, common narratives, factors like transport integration. Now, one of the things that is out there as a hypothesis that we see being used deliberately to construct a sense of shared identity, of nationhood, is actually social transfers, social welfare spending. So you think about going back to the 19th century, the founding of the German Empire under Bismarck and the expansion of social spending, first old age pension system, healthcare system, and so on. You think about World War II, the Beveridge Plan, trying to convince the British working class that fighting for Britain is a good idea. This is obviously a strategy that's been used and seems plausible to many people for the longest time. Now, how do we actually go about testing this empirically as social scientists? And what Bruno and I have done in the research underlying our chapter is to go to one particular case that's particularly useful for examining these questions, which is the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, what's special about the US in the 1930s and 1940s? If you want to examine what nation building, being patriotism really means, you want to look at costly actions. And the costliest action of all is to fight. But typically in most countries, that's not a choice. In many cases, there's conscription. So the US is great for our case because just like in World War I, while they bring in conscription, there's a window at the beginning of the war when you can actually volunteer. So we can use that. And then there's two other dimensions of patriotic actions that we can also use, which is how many war bonds you buy. We have detailed data for the US from this period, and how many medals people win, the ultimate costly action, because many of these medals are awarded posthumously, so these people actually get themselves killed trying to fight for their country. The second reason why looking at the US in the 1930s and 1940s is a good idea is that they bring in social welfare spending on a scale that's completely unprecedented in a relatively short period of time. In 1933, most Americans never had any contact with the federal government, except through the post office. By 1939, the federal government was the single biggest employer in the United States. The US government's share of GDP went from 3% to 9% or so. So this is what we're going to try to argue in this paper, that as the welfare state in the US expands, is what they, as part of this program that we call the New Deal, under the aegis of President Roosevelt, those Americans that benefit increasingly think of themselves as part of the nation, and they're willing to undertake costly actions benefiting the rest of the country. That's the hypothesis that we want to test. So let me tell you first about the kind of data that we can use, and then I'll talk about a few of the empirical challenges and the implications. So the first thing we look at, this is the least costly action, is to buy war bonds. You can buy war bonds in very small denominations. They're marketed as a form of patriotism, as you can see in these wartime posters. They do pay a return, but it's not as good as the private sector alternatives. And we have very granular data across the US, how many of these war bonds are actually sold relative to population or relative to wealth. Second action is you can go and sign up to fight for Uncle Sam. And this is what the enlistment office in New York looked like on the day after Pearl Harbor. So you have this wave of people who are willing to now come forward and actually go and become soldiers. And again, we have a lot of detailed data on exactly how many of these there are. The third one is actually winning a medal. So here's one famous example. It's somebody who actually got the Congressional Medal of Honor. I'm not going to read everything that he does, but he does get himself killed. And again, we can just total up the high-end medals for true acts of bravery, going above and beyond the call of duty, as it says in the citation, and say, how frequent is this at the local level? And the thing that we're first going to do, just to establish some broad sense of what the data looks like, is to throw this against the local incidence of New Deal grants, of social transfers in the 1930s, which looks like this, okay? So the more red a county, the more spending relative to population you have in one county here. So if you just run this simple measure of how many transfers there are against these indicators of patriotic actions, you get these satisfyingly upward sloping lines in all three dimensions. War bonds, volunteers, medals, everything goes up as you have more spending through the New Deal at the per capita level. Now, there are many questions you can ask and say, well, how do we know that the people who benefit are the ones who volunteer, right? Maybe it's a depressed area, hence they get lots of grants and then they don't have anything other to do but to go and be shot at by the Germans. Maybe that's just not what's going on. So we do two things to establish causality. The first one is to look at one particular source of variation. So there's a major environmental disaster in the United States in the 1930s known as the Dust Bowl. So the topsoil in large parts of the Midwest actually starts to disappear. That's just a weather shock. And we can show that that influences New Deal spending because a large part of it is agricultural. And this part of the variation induced by a natural disaster actually has this predictive power for all these voluntary actions. Now, in terms of volunteering, you could still say, well, it's an adverse economic shock, but it even works for war bonds where you wouldn't expect it to the same extent. There's no reason why it should work for metals. The second thing we do is actually go down to the individual level. So we actually digitize and link to the census data on who volunteers and whether they were employed by one of these government make-work programs like the WPA. And it's the people themselves. You can show that it's the individual who receives support, who's actually being looked after by Uncle Sam, that actually volunteer to a much greater extent. We can't look at the other outcomes for them, but we can do it for volunteering. So if we do this overall, what we find is there seems to be something like generalized reciprocity. The government looks after you, and then people act as if they're actually grateful towards this abstract entity of the nation that's helped them in times of need. And now they do something very costly, even to the point of getting killed, potentially, in order to pay back what they have received. So we think this is an important finding in the sense that here we can actually show how the mechanics of this important notion that nation building in part has to do with shared risk and transfers can actually be demonstrated empirically. And it also suggests that there's a sort of broader research strand about what are the origins of state capacity that can be actually underpinned empirically, where state capacity isn't just what comes out of the barrel of a gun in Mao's famous phrase. It's not just about projecting power, but it's actually about a sort of interlocking set of social relationships of reciprocal support, or what people call relational state capacity. And as you can see here in the final slide, is a cartoon from the time. This is the underlying notion. There's the forgotten man, the man on the left in the overalls, obviously an agricultural worker, shaking the hand of FDR saying, you remembered me. So this is the emotional basis for what ultimately, if you sort of think about it as a one-shot game, is actually an irrational behavior. It's reciprocating towards the nation state, but for which we find overwhelming empirical evidence.
Let me thank Noam, Vicky, and Hans Joachim for this very, very nice introductions into their chapters. So this is an illustration of what we have as individual chapters in the books. These are really, like, it's not surprising that we're invited these chapter participants, because we think that these three chapters are incredibly important to understanding what is possible with nation building and how it works, but there are others really amazing things as well. So let me just finish up with one point, which is that we are going to collect the slides for all individual chapters, and we'll try to make it available for people who are teaching the material, which I, as a person who teaches two political economy courses, will appreciate for sure. And I'm sure there will be others as well. So we'll try to make it a real public good, and we're happy to think more about these issues, which are very, very important, particularly in these hard times with a lot of geopolitical challenges. And actually, we do see some lessons from the book which are applicable to today's times as well. But given that it's 6 o'clock and we're supposed to finish up here, thank you everybody a lot again. And it was just a great endeavor, and I really honored to be with you here. Thank you.
From my side as well, thanks so much to all the authors of all the chapters, to the whole CEPR. Amazing work. Ellis, who did a lot, Anil, who did the whole typesetting, Sophie, the whole coordination of the book. So it's really amazing, and so CEPR puts a lot of resources in that and creates a great public good. And thanks a lot to everybody also for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.